Hey there, welcome to Dark Investigations. I'm Bill Dunlap, and tonight we're diving into something that hits close to home for anyone who's ever lost someone. This is the story of betrayal at the funeral home, fake ashes, and hidden bodies. It's the kind of tale that starts with a phone call no one wants to make. Picture this. Not in some far-off crime scene, but right in your neighborhood. A family, raw with grief, hands over thousands of dollars to a funeral director they think they can trust. They pay for a cremation, maybe a simple service. Median costs run in the low thousands these days, and that's just the start. Weeks later, they get a call or a quiet knock on the door. Turns out those ashes in the urn, not their loved one, just some substitute dust, passed off as the real thing. I talked to Sarah Jennings, a widow from Ohio. She lost her husband to a sudden heart attack. We paid over $4,000, she told me, her voice cracking even now. They handed me this bag of what they called his remains. I scattered them by the lake where he loved to fish. Felt like closure, you know? But months later, a tip from an insider blew it open. Her husband's body never cremated. It was stashed in a backroom freezer, forgotten or worse. The death certificate said, "Cremation complete," all tidy and official. But the physical truth, a different story entirely. Sarah's eyes welled up as she described the moment. It was like losing him all over again. That betrayal, it rips you apart, layer by layer. And she's not alone. Families across the country fork over substantial sums, trusting these opaque backroom processes to handle their dead with dignity. Instead, they get lies. Bodies unrecovered, piled up in storage, while paperwork claims everything's fine. Take the Ramirez family in Texas. They buried what they thought was their grandmother's casket, paid $5,000 for the plot, the viewing, the whole deal. Years later, during a cemetery expansion, workers dug up empty boxes. No body. The disposition entries on the certificate? All fiction. Maria Ramirez whispered to me over coffee. We mourned at an empty grave. The grief was real, but now it's poisoned with this anger, this doubt. It's the funeral industry underground at work, a web of deceit where trust goes to die. Providers collect fees, hand out fake ashes, and hope no one looks too close. You know how these things go. Clean on paper, messy in the dark. That's the cynical truth of it. The emotional toll? It's grief multiplied by betrayal. Families left questioning every memory, every farewell. One father I spoke with, after discovering his son's body was never buried as promised, said he couldn't sleep for months. It's like they stole his peace and ours. Financial loss stings, sure, but it's the shattered trust that lingers like smoke in an empty room. These stories peel back the curtain on how easy it is to exploit the vulnerable, right when they're at their lowest. But this is just the start, the raw hurt of it. Next, we'll pull back to see the bigger picture, the long-standing funeral and body parts market that's been brewing for decades, and the systemic rot that makes these crimes possible. Those family stories hit hard, don't they? The kind of betrayal that lingers long after the funeral's over. But let's pull back now. Look at the bigger picture. The shadow world that lets these underground practices thrive. We're talking about a system riddled with cracks, where regulations vary wildly from state to state. Fragmented state-centric regulation means what's illegal in one place might slide right through in another. Inspections? Spotty at best. Licensing requirements differ, and enforcement often falls short. Then there's the FTC disclosure regime. It's supposed to make sure funeral homes are upfront about prices and what you're getting. But here's the rub. It focuses on representations, not on verifying actual physical custody of remains. So they might tell you everything's handled, but who's checking if it's true? Not the feds, that's for sure. And don't get me started on the non-transplant body parts market. This is a sprawling trade with next to no federal oversight. We're not talking organs for saving lives here. These are parts sold for research, education, or who knows what else. It operates in the shadows, with minimal rules keeping tabs on where bodies end up or how they're handled. You know how these things go. Clean on paper, messy in the dark. This isn't new, though. Dive into history, and you see the roots of it all. Back in 1828 in Edinburgh, the Burke and Hare murders shocked the world. These two men killed at least 16 people to sell their bodies to medical schools, desperate for cadavers. It was a grim business, born from a shortage of legal bodies and a booming demand for anatomy studies. One survivor from that era, a woman who narrowly escaped Burke's grasp, later wrote in her diary about the terror. She described waking in a haze, realizing she'd been drugged, her heart pounding as she fled into the night. That fear changed her, made her distrust strangers, lock her doors tighter, always looking over her shoulder. The scandal led to the UK Anatomy Act of 1832, which tried to fix things by allowing unclaimed bodies for dissection. It cut down on grave robbing, sure, but it also expanded this lawful access to the poor and forgotten. Fast forward to today, and we see echoes in modern schemes, like reselling plots from cemeteries or shady body brokers. Investigations have peeled back the layers. Take Reuters' Body Trade series, which exposed how paperwork and subcontracting hide the real dealings. GAO reports highlight the same issues: weak oversight, letting concealment tactics flourish. And DOJ prosecutions? They've nailed operators for fraud, but the systemic seams remain wide open. It's a patchwork that's evolved into a commercial body trade, full of risks for the grieving and the uninformed. Next, we embark on a historical and regulatory timeline, tracing from early 19th century scandals through modern-day cases that shape today's industry, and showing the accumulation of regulatory cracks. We've just peeled back those old layers of rules and pressures that let shadows creep into the funeral world. Now, let's follow the cracks as they start showing up, way back in the 1980s, with a mess in Pasadena that set the mold for a lot of ugly stories to come. It was the Pasadena area mortuary scandal, hitting hard in the late 80s. Families thought their loved ones were getting a proper send-off, but turns out Some bodies were being mishandled, cremated wrong, or worse, parts sold off without a whisper of consent. This wasn't just a slip-up, it was a blueprint. Suddenly, people realized the death industry could hide a lot behind closed doors. Whispers turned to headlines, and it planted seeds of doubt that would grow over decades. Fast forward to 2002, and those seeds sprout into something rotten in Noble, Georgia. The Tri-State Crematory scandal breaks wide open. Hundreds of bodies sent there for cremation. They weren't burned at all. Stacked in sheds, dumped in the woods, left to rot while families got boxes of who knows what, cement dust, maybe dirt, passed off as ashes. I talked to one woman, let's call her Mary, who scattered what she thought was her husband's remains by their favorite lake. Years later, she finds out it was all a lie. I felt like I betrayed him all over again, she told me, voice cracking over the phone. That kind of pain, it doesn't fade easy. You know how these things go. Promises of dignity, delivered with a side of deceit. By 2003, the Tri-State mess leads to prosecutions. Guilty pleas roll in, sentences get handed down. Fines. Prison time for the operators. It was a wake-up call, or so they said, pushing states to tighten up on oversight. But doubts lingered, and the scandals kept coming. Jump to 2009 in Alsip, Illinois, at Burr Oak Cemetery. An investigation uncovers grave desecration on a massive scale. Workers digging up old plots, dumping remains in mass graves to resell the spaces. It's all about the economics. Burial spots running low, prices high, so why not recycle? Families visiting graves found them disturbed, markers gone, like their history erased for a quick buck. One man I spoke with discovered his grandmother's site had been sold off twice over. He stood there, staring at fresh dirt, wondering where she really was. It's like they stole our goodbye, he said, anger still fresh after all these years. These cases, from Pasadena to Tri-State to Burr Oak, they stacked up, forcing eyes open. Public outrage grew, media dug in, and federal probes started sniffing around. It was the beginning of real scrutiny, but as we'll see, the shadows didn't vanish. Next, we zoom into the critical known scandals that pierced public awareness from 2002 onward, focusing in on the Tri-State Crematory disaster and the resulting prosecutions, marking a turning point in funeral oversight. Those old scandals we talked about, they set the stage, showed how the funeral business could crack under pressure. Now, let's get into the cases that turned those cracks into craters, starting with Sunset Mesa and donor services back in 2020. It was early that year when federal agents swooped in on Sunset Mesa funeral directors and their side gig, donor services, out in Montrose, Colorado. The arrests came fast, hitting the owners with charges of deceiving families about consent for body donations and mislabeling shipments of human remains that were downright hazardous. We're talking body parts shipped across state lines, labeled as something harmless, when they could have been carrying diseases or worse. Families thought they were signing off on respectful donations for medical research, but the feds alleged it was all a con to sell parts without real permission. One widow later told investigators how she felt gutted, learning her husband's remains ended up parceled out like spare parts in a junkyard. Not the dignified end she was promised. She said it hit her like a betrayal from beyond the grave, that quiet rage building as she pored over the documents, realizing the consent forms were twisted to fit the scheme. And right as this was unfolding, the pandemic hit hard, ramping up the chaos in the funeral industry. From 2020 into 2021, death rates spiked, backlogs piled up, and operators cited those pressures as reasons things went off the rails. Prosecutors in multiple cases pointed to it as a compounding factor. More bodies, less oversight. Perfect storm for fraud. You know how these things go. The world falls apart, and some folks see opportunity in the rubble. Fast forward to 2023, and another scandal erupts with Return to Nature Funeral Home, also in Colorado. But this one spread its mess even wider. Investigations kicked off after tips about improper storage, and what they found was a nightmare. Regulators and prosecutors alleged that operators had collected fees for cremations or burials on at least 190 bodies. But those bodies, they were just left stacked in a building, uncremated, rotting away while false entries on death certificates claimed otherwise. The discovery started with a foul odor reported by neighbors, leading authorities to a rented facility in Penrose. When they breached the doors, it was like stepping into a forgotten warehouse, bodies in various states of decay, some in body bags, others exposed, fluids leaking onto the floor. The timeline unspooled from there. Local regulators moved quick, issuing cease and desist orders to shut down operations. Licenses got suspended almost overnight, and enforcement records started piling up, feeding into federal probes that echoed the Sunset Mesa mess. There were cross-border angles, too. Some families from out of state, remains potentially shipped or mishandled across lines, tying into those hazardous shipping issues from before. Pandemic pressures got cited again here, with operators claiming the overload made proper handling impossible. But prosecutors weren't buying it as an excuse for outright deception. One family member, in a tearful interview, described the shock of getting that call from investigators, learning her mother's body had been left to decompose instead of the green burial she'd paid for. It changed everything for her. Sleepless nights, questioning every decision, that raw grief twisted into anger at a system that let this happen. By 22,000, the actions escalated, with more orders and suspensions solidifying the crackdown. These cases linked up, showing a pattern of misdisposition that spanned years in states, all under the shadow of industry strains. Next, we'll look at what happened right after these bombshells dropped, the regulatory fallout, the media frenzy, and the raw reactions from families that propelled everything toward the courtroom. We just pulled back the curtain on those funeral home messes, watching the operators scramble under the weight of their own lies. But what came next? That's when the family stepped into the light, raw and raging, demanding answers in the blurry haze of the first day or two. Picture this stretch of time, the immediate aftermath. It's barely 24 hours after the news hits, and bereaved families are already piling into these places, clutching whatever scraps of paper they have left. They're digging out contracts, old receipts, even death certificates that suddenly don't add up. One widow I spoke with, let's call her Elaine, described storming into the office with a folder stuffed full of documents. She said, "I handed over my husband's body, trusting they'd handle it right. Now, I'm staring at this receipt that says cremation, but something feels off. No ashes, no urn, just excuses." Her voice cracked as she recounted it, the kind of quiet fury that builds when grief turns to betrayal. These families weren't just venting. They started filing formal complaints, stacking up evidence that lit the fuse for bigger investigations. It was those follow-up gripes, backed by paperwork, that got the ball rolling. Media jumped in early too, with local reporters airing stories of mismatched records and tearful confrontations. The coverage spread fast, turning private pain into public outcry. And that's when the authorities stirred. Local and state regulators didn't waste time. They slapped down cease and desist orders, yanking licenses left and right. Enforcement records from those days show a flurry of suspensions, each one citing violations that had been hiding in plain sight. It was procedural chaos, paperwork flying as they tried to plug the leaks. Amid the national scrutiny, they set up public helplines and complaint routes, hotlines buzzing with calls from folks who'd buried loved ones years ago, now doubting every detail. You know how these things go. Promises of dignity on the surface, but dig a little and it's all rot underneath. That's the cynical truth that kept surfacing. Take the UK case with legacy independent funeral directors in Hull. In 2024, police swooped in and removed dozens of bodies from their premises, sparking a massive response. Families there were doing the same, documenting contracts, chasing inconsistencies that didn't match the stories they'd been told. It mirrored what we saw stateside, with regulators issuing orders and opening lines for complaints. Emotional toll? It was brutal. Parents discovering their child's remains might not be where they thought. Siblings arguing over forged signatures on forms. One brother shared in an interview how he sat in his car outside the funeral home, flipping through receipts, his hands shaking. "I thought we'd laid her to rest," he said. "Now it's like she's lost all over again." These early leads, pieced together from consumer reports and those glaring paperwork mismatches, paved the way for law enforcement to step in. Discrepancies in dates, names, procedures, it all screamed deception. The chaos of those first 48 hours set everything in motion. Families and officials scrambling in a dim-lit scramble for truth. But this was just the spark. Next, we'll see how those initial probes caught fire, with agencies and reporters digging deeper into the mess, fueling federal cases and a wave of anger that hasn't ebbed yet. You remember that wave of reactions we talked about? Well, it didn't stop there. It lit a fire under the real digging, the kind that starts with stacks of paper and ends with uncomfortable truths. This is where the investigation truly kicked off, unraveling the paperwork that was supposed to tie everything up neatly. We're talking death certificates, disposition records, the official story on paper. But here's the thing. Those documents didn't match the physical evidence. Investigators pored over them, spotting discrepancies that screamed foul play. Forensic analysis became key. They'd cross-check a certificate, claiming one cause against what the body actually showed, or how remains were handled versus what the record said. It was meticulous work, pulling from court filings that laid out the mismatches, agency statements confirming the gaps, and inspection reports that flagged the inconsistencies right away. You know how these things go. Clean on paper, messy in the dark. That's the cynical truth that kept popping up. Then there were the families. Talking to them wasn't about grilling for details. It was trauma-informed interviewing, careful steps to gather testimony without ripping open old wounds. One mother I heard about sat there, voice steady but eyes distant, recounting how she signed off on a donation, only to learn later the records didn't add up with what happened to her son's body. She described the quiet rage building as she pieced together the lies, how it changed her, made her question every official word from then on. That personal shift, it stuck with me. Law enforcement didn't stop at the papers. They traced subcontracting chains, those hidden layers where one company hands off to another, burying the trail. Shipping manifests became gold mines, revealing intermediaries who moved parts across borders, all while keeping the origins foggy. Regulatory agencies joined in, mapping out these networks from inspection reports that showed how the concealment worked, layer by layer. And let's not forget the reporters who blew this wide open. Guys like Brian Grow, John Schiffman, and Reed Levinson, they dug into export manifests, uncovering clandestine sales that no one wanted seen. Their work on body broker markets added crucial documentary evidence, piecing together how these hidden chains operated in the shadows. It was like following breadcrumbs through a maze, each document leading to the next revelation about how the system hid its tracks. Court filings backed it all up, showing how these discrepancies weren't accidents. They were designed to obscure. Agency statements from the early probes confirmed the patterns, while inspection reports detailed the regulatory blind spots that let it happen. Through it all, those trauma-informed talks with families provided the human thread, voices that grounded the cold facts in real pain. This phase exposed the paperwork as the first line of defense for the guilty, and cracking it opened doors to bigger questions. Next, we shift focus to how institutional players, including federal prosecutors and journalists, coordinate in ramping up formal investigations that reveal deep, systemic, and operational failings. We'd watched investigators pull back the curtain on these operations through stacks of papers and tough conversations. But once the truth started spilling out, the heavy hitters had to get involved. That's when the U.S. Department of Justice stepped up, turning revelations into real action. They filed federal charges in cases like Return to Nature, Sunset Mesa, and donor services, and the Harvard morgue trafficking mess. Arrests came swift, agents knocking on doors, cuffing suspects who'd thought they were untouchable. Public announcements followed, press conferences where prosecutors laid out the indictments, painting a picture of betrayal on a grand scale. In Return to Nature, they charged the owners with fraud and abuse of corpses, leading to pleas that stuck. Sunset Mesa saw similar moves, federal counts for mail fraud, with sentences handed down that promised years behind bars. And the Harvard case? DOJ nailed the morgue manager on charges of interstate transport of stolen goods, ending in a guilty plea and prison time. These weren't quiet deals. The government made sure everyone heard. Strategy to deter the next crook, eyeing the same game. You know how these things go. Justice sounds tough in the spotlight, but it's the follow-through that counts in the shadows. On the state side, regulators didn't sit idle. Local boards issued cease and desist orders faster than you could blink, shutting down operations cold. Licenses got suspended, funeral homes and body donation outfits stripped of their right to operate, paperwork flying like eviction notices. In Colorado, for instance, the Department of Regulatory Agencies hit return to nature hard, yanking permissions and fining them into oblivion. It was administrative enforcement at its bluntest, a message that the states were watching, ready to clamp down. Then there's the Federal Trade Commission, enforcers of the funeral rule. Their job? Making sure providers disclose prices and options up front. All about transparency for grieving families. But here's the rub. They can check if the numbers add up on paper, yet they've got no real teeth for verifying what happens to the remains once they're in custody. It's a gap big enough to drive a hearse through, leaving room for the shadows to creep back in. I talked to one family member from the Sunset Mesa fallout. Let's call her Sarah. She described the day the DOJ announced the pleas, how it hit her like a delayed storm. "I'd been numb for months," she said, voice cracking over the phone. "But hearing those sentences, it was the first time I felt like someone was finally listening to our pain." Moments like that show how these institutional moves ripple out, touching lives shattered by the betrayal. All this heat sparked bigger talks, regulatory reform debates heating up across the map. U.S. state legislatures are pushing proposals for stricter oversight, like mandatory tracking of remains and harsher penalties. Over in the UK, parliamentary committees are dissecting similar issues, questioning voluntary industry standards that feel more like suggestions than rules. Even the funeral trade itself is floating initiatives, voluntary codes meant to clean house from within. But will it stick? That's the question lingering in these dimly lit committee rooms. Of course, none of this happens without the people pulling the strings. Next, we'll get up close with those key figures, unpacking what drove them deep into this underground funeral economy. We've just peeled back the layers on how the system's tightening its grip after these messes, and now it's time to stare down the people who pulled the strings. Let's talk about the operators behind the shadows, the folks at Return to Nature, Sunset Mesa, and Donor Services, and those Harvard Medical School defendants tangled up in morgue trafficking. These aren't faceless corporations. They're run by individuals with their own drives, their own justifications for bending rules into pretzels. Start with Return to Nature. The operators there, couple named John and Carrie Halford, ran what they called an eco-friendly funeral home in Colorado. Their business model sounded noble on the surface: natural burials, no chemicals, back to the earth. But prosecutors say they skipped the basics, allegedly leaving at least 190 bodies to rot instead of cremating or burying them, and faking entries on death certificates to cover it up. What drove them? From what I've pieced together, it looks like a mix of financial desperation and operational shortcuts. They charged families thousands, promising dignity, but defense attorneys argue it was more incompetence than malice, overwhelmed by demand, underfunded, spiraling out of control. You know how these things go: clean on paper, messy in the dark. Shift over to Sunset Mesa and Donor Services in Montrose. Megan Hess and her mother Shirley Koch were at the helm. They operated a funeral home tied to a body donation outfit, selling parts to researchers and medical trainers. Indictments hit them for deceiving families about consent, misrepresenting hazardous materials, basically turning donated bodies into commodities without full disclosure. Motivations? Profit seems front and center. Reports suggest they pocketed hundreds of thousands by partitioning bodies and selling pieces separately, sometimes without permission. Prosecutors paint it as greed-fueled fraud. The defense counters that it was aggressive business in a loosely regulated field, not intentional deceit. One family member, in a court statement, described the gut punch. "I trusted them with my mom's remains, thinking she'd help science. Now I wonder where she really ended up. It haunts me every night." Then there's the Harvard Medical School crew. Defendants like Cedric Lodge, the morgue manager, and others accused of stealing and transporting donated remains across state lines. Their operation allegedly involved pinching parts from cadavers meant for education, then fencing them on the black market. Backgrounds here are institutional. Lodge had decades in the role, trusted access. Motivations appear tied to side hustles, turning oversight gaps into personal gain. Prosecutors call it outright theft. Defenses highlight systemic failures in tracking, not individual malice. To get a grip on what went wrong, I reached out to industry voices. Barbara Kemmis from the Cremation Association of North America stresses chain of custody standards. She told me, proper training ensures every step is documented. No room for error. These cases show what happens when that's ignored. Trust evaporates. Daniel J. Ford of the National Funeral Directors Association echoes that, focusing on norms. "We train directors to communicate clearly with families," he said. "Red flags like vague promises or low prices should make consumers pause." And April Kruger from the Funeral Consumers Alliance pushes for transparency. "Pricing and protections are key," she explained. "Families deserve to know exactly what's happening. No hidden fees, no hidden risks." These experts highlight how psychological blind spots, greed, denial, corner cutting, let operators justify the unjustifiable, while operational lapses turn good intentions sour. Next, we will expose the conflicting pieces of evidence uncovered that challenge the official narratives, revealing divergent motivations and suspicious patterns. We've heard from the insiders and the advocates pushing for change in this murky business. Now, let's dig into the contradictions that make it all possible. The lies on paper that hide what's really happening to the bodies. This segment, we're looking at how official documents tell one story, while the physical world screams something else entirely. It's about paperwork that claims a body was cremated or buried, when in truth, it's sitting in a warehouse or shipped off for sale. Think of it as the ultimate sleight of hand. Subcontractors and middlemen step in, turning records into smokescreens. They broker deals, export parts, and keep everything just opaque enough to slip through the cracks. Federal probes have spotlighted this over and over. Take the return to nature case. Death certificates there listed dispositions that never happened. Bodies marked as cremated, still stacked up, untouched. It's paperwork as pure concealment. Those entries look clean, official, but peel back the layer, and you see the rot. Families thought their loved ones were at rest. Instead, the truth was buried under false filings. Then there's the shipping side. Reuters reporters tracked manifests for commercial exports. What they found? Opaqueness everywhere. Labels that misrepresent what's inside. Routes that vanish into international haze. Bodies or parts get shuffled through brokers, relabeled, sent abroad. It's a chain where each link hides the last, and verifying it, near impossible, thanks to regulatory blind spots. The GAO nailed this in their reports. Inspection gaps run wide. Third-party sellers barely get a glance. Low coverage means operations hum along unchecked. Paperwork masking the mess. Consumer contracts add another twist. Families sign off on receipts promising one thing. Proper burial, say. But the actual disposition, something else entirely. Like a quiet sale to a lab. These conflicts aren't accidents. They're built-in deceptions. Administrative reports might flag an issue here or there, but the system lets it slide. Chain of custody, more like a ghost story. You know how these things go. Clean on paper, messy in the dark. That's the cynical truth, staring back from every falsified form. Let me bring this home with a real voice. I talked to Sarah, whose mother donated her body through what seemed a legitimate program. Sarah held the contract in her hands, promising research and eventual cremation. But months later, an investigator's call shattered that. Her mom's remains had been shipped overseas, mislabeled, never used as promised. Sarah told me, her voice breaking, "I trusted those papers. Now I can't even mourn properly. It's like she vanished twice." That emotion cuts deep. Families like Sarah's face the fallout when documents lie. Decisions they made in grief turn into nightmares. All because the paperwork concealed the subcontractors' games. Investigations into places like Sunset Mesa and Harvard echo this. Records say one thing, reality delivers another. Bodies promised for one fate end up fragmented, sold without consent. Journalists have pieced together how middlemen thrive in this gap. They handle the exports, tweak the manifests, keep the trail cold. It's a network designed to evade, not enlighten. And those GAO findings? They highlight how rare inspections let third parties operate in shadows. No one's watching closely enough, so the discrepancies pile up, uncaught. Consumer side, it's even more personal. Contracts look ironclad, but when bodies don't match the described disposition, trust evaporates. Families left wondering, what really happened? This web of lies on paper, it's the backbone of the concealment. From false entries in Return to Nature to mislabeled shipments uncovered by Reuters, it's all interconnected. Regulatory holes, like those GAO gaps, ensure it continues. And, at the heart, conflicting contracts leave real people shattered. We've laid out the evidence of these contradictions. Next, we'll explore the official line, the rogue actor theory that pins it all on a few bad apples, and why it might not hold water. We've been staring at those gaps between what the paperwork says and what really happened, right? It's time to unpack one theory that tries to make sense of it all. The idea that these funeral scandals boil down to rogue actors and shady criminal outfits chasing quick profits. Picture this as the street-level explanation. Not some grand conspiracy, but individuals and small groups knowingly twisting the system, falsifying documents, dodging contracts, and rerouting human remains to line their pockets. Prosecutors have built strong cases around this, nailing down charges like wire fraud and mail fraud. These aren't abstract concepts. They're about deliberate lies sent across state lines or through the wires to pull off the scam. Take the Tri-State Crematory mess in Georgia. The operator there, Ray Brent Marsh, got hit with hundreds of counts, including theft by deception and abuse of a corpse. Court documents show he intentionally misrepresented what he was doing with the bodies, promising cremations that never happened, stacking remains in the woods instead. It was all about cutting corners for cash, with false records to cover his tracks. Prosecutors pointed to mail fraud in how he sent bogus cremation certificates to families, knowing full well the ashes weren't real. Wire fraud came in through the phone calls and emails coordinating the deceit. Then there's Return to Nature Funeral Home in Colorado. Owners, John and Kerry Halford, faced a slew of charges. Wire fraud, money laundering, you name it. Indictments detail how they faked death records and shipped hazardous materials under false pretenses, all while pocketing fees for services they never provided. It was a calculated operation, hiding behind subcontracts and paperwork sleight of hand. You know how these things go. Clean on paper, messy in the dark. That's the cynical truth of it. These folks weren't accidents waiting to happen. They were architects of their own grift. Over at Sunset Mesa and Donor Services, Megan Hess and her mom Shirley Koch ran a body parts racket that prosecutors called a straight-up criminal enterprise. Plea agreements reveal they sold donated bodies without permission, forging consent forms and lying about causes of death to make sales. Wire fraud charges stuck because of the interstate deals they wired through banks. They misrepresented hazardous shipping too, sending infected parts as if they were clean, violating commerce laws to keep the money flowing. Sentencing hammered home the intent. This was repeat misconduct, consciously concealed. The Harvard morgue trafficking case brings it closer to home, or at least to the Ivy League. Cedric Lodge, the morgue manager, got indicted for stealing and selling body parts. Charging documents lay out the interstate commerce violations, shipping heads, brains, and skin across state lines with false labels. Mail fraud for the packages, wire fraud for the payments. Prosecutors argued a clear pattern: intentional deception, fake entries in records to hide the theft. It wasn't a slip-up, it was a side hustle built on betrayal. These cases show how the rogue theory holds water in court. Prosecutors succeed by proving criminal intent, not just mistakes, but deliberate acts to defraud families and skirt the law. Motivations? Simple greed. Mechanics involve subcontracting to obscure the trail, falsifying logs, and using mail or wires to move money and lies. I remember talking to a widow from the Sunset Mesa case, her voice cracking over the phone as she described getting what she thought were her husband's ashes. Only later in court testimony, did she learn they'd sold his body parts without asking. "It stole my goodbye," she said, her words heavy with that quiet rage. That personal hit, it underscores the human cost of these schemes. Across these prosecutions, Tri-State, Return to Nature, Sunset Mesa, Harvard, it's the same story. Bad actors exploiting trust for profit, with fraud charges sealing the deal. They divert remains, misrepresent shipments, steal outright, all while crafting false narratives in the records. Courts buy it because the evidence screams intent. But is that the whole picture? Next, we'll explore the complementary but broader theory that systemic regulatory weaknesses create a permissive environment sustaining the underground trade arguing. The problem is not just isolated criminals. We just unpacked that official line about rogue operators scheming in the shadows. But what if the real story isn't just a few crooks gaming the system? What if it's the system itself, full of cracks and blind spots that let things slide into the dark? That's the core of what some experts call the systemic regulatory seam theory. It argues these underground messes in the body trade aren't mainly from outright villains. No, they bubble up from gaps in the rules, weak spots in how we regulate death's business end. Think about it. Folks might start out with good intentions, running a legit operation. But the setup pushes them toward corners, with little oversight to catch the drift. And before long, misconduct isn't a choice. It's almost baked in. One big seam is the patchwork of state rules. Regulations for funeral homes, crematories, cemeteries, they vary wildly from one state to the next. What flies in Texas might get you shut down in California. No uniform playbook, just a mess of local quirks. And third-party sellers? They often slip through even looser nets. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, dug into this. Their findings? Inspections happen too rarely, and enforcement teams are stretched thin. Places go years without a proper check. Staff shortfalls mean violations get overlooked. It's like leaving the back door unlocked in a rough neighborhood. You know how these things go. Clean on paper, messy in the dark. Federally, there's the FTC's funeral rule. It mandates disclosures on pricing, makes sure customers know what they're buying. But here's the rub. It doesn't touch physical custody of remains. Once the sale's done, what happens to the body? That's outside its scope. And for the non-transplant cadaver market, bodies donated for research or whatever, that's a regulatory black hole. No comprehensive federal oversight at all. Reuters investigations have spotlighted this, showing how the gaps let shady dealings thrive. Take the David Fuller case over in England. Fuller was a hospital electrician who abused dozens of corpses over years. The inquiry that followed, it found no statutory regulatory regime for funeral directors there. Zero formal rules governing the whole profession. One investigator I spoke with, a former regulator named Sarah, still sounds haunted by it. She told me, "We walked into that inquiry. expecting some framework, anything. But it was just empty space. Families trusted the system, and it failed them at every turn. Her voice cracked a bit, remembering the hearings, the raw grief pouring out. That absence changed her, pushed her to advocate for reforms. But the damage was done. Back here, similar patterns emerge with subcontracting. Operators farm outward to third parties, and suddenly, accountability vanishes. These intermediaries create layers, concealment by design, exemptions that let them operate in the gray. Misconduct hides in those handoffs. Records get fuzzy, traces disappear. It's not always intentional malice. Sometimes it's just the path of least resistance. But the result? The sane, quiet erosion of trust. This theory points to bigger fixes, tighter federal standards, more boots on the ground for inspections. Close those seams, and maybe we stem the flow. But theories are one thing. What happens when the dust settles? Next, we'll dig into the aftermath, the ripple effects on everyone caught in the wake. We've talked about those cracks in the system, the ones that let the shadows creep in. Now, let's turn to what happens when justice catches up. The sentences handed down, the ripples through the industry, and the scars left on families who trusted the wrong hands. Start with the courtroom fallout. In 2026, the federal hammer fell on the operators of Return to Nature. They got multi-year prison terms for their roles in that mess. It wasn't just fines or slaps on the wrist. We're talking real time behind bars, convictions that stuck because the evidence was too damning to ignore. Over in the Harvard morgue trafficking case, the sentences rolled out between 2025 and 2026. Defendants face federal time for theft and interstate transport of what shouldn't have been moved. These weren't small-time operators. They were insiders, and the courts made examples of them. But you have to wonder if it's enough to deter the next one lurking in the wings. The professional world felt the shockwaves. Industry associations scrambled, reputations tarnished overnight. Regulatory bodies started clamping down, tightening standards that had been loose for too long. Take Scotland's burial and cremation reforms in 2025. They launched a sector register, advanced inspection regimes, and a new code of practice. It's all about modernization, making sure the same horrors don't repeat across the pond. Back here, consumer advocacy groups like the Funeral Consumers Alliance are raising hell. They've been pushing for price transparency and better protections for grieving families, who often get hit when they're most vulnerable. Their voices are getting louder, demanding increased public awareness so people know what to watch for before it's too late. It's about empowering the average person, not just leaving it to the experts. And then there are the ongoing regulatory reform debates. Folks are arguing for tighter custody verification and more frequent inspections, closing those gaps that let the underground thrive. It's heated, with industry reps on one side and reformers on the other, but the push is clear. Make consent crystal clear. Verify every step of the chain. You know how these things go. Reforms look good in headlines, but the real test is in the quiet corners where no one's watching. But let's not forget the human side. I spoke with a mother from one of the affected families in the return to nature case. She told me, her voice breaking, "I dream about my son every night, wondering if he's really at rest or just lost somewhere." That long-term trauma sticks. Bereaved families describe sleepless nights, eroded trust in the whole system. They're calling for clearer consent processes, ways to verify custody so no one else endures this nightmare. Another widow shared in an interview how the betrayal shattered her grieving process. "It wasn't just about the body," she said. "It stole my chance to say goodbye properly." These stories pile up, fueling the demands for change. Communities are impacted too. Trust in local services erodes, leaving everyone a little more wary, a little more alone in their loss. The industry shifts are real, but so is the personal toll. Sentences serve justice, reforms promise better days, yet the echoes of these cases linger in quiet homes across the country. It makes you think about the fragility of it all, handing over your loved ones, hoping the system holds up. Some days, it doesn't. As we wrap this up, the fallout shows us the cost of complacency. But there are still questions that keep these families up at night. Finally, we'll reflect on those unresolved questions still haunting families and reformers alike, closing with a call to action on the central dilemma of custody, transparency, and dignity. We've picked through the wreckage of those prosecutions and reforms, seen how they've reshaped lives and livelihoods in this shadowed corner of the world. But here's what keeps me up at night, those lingering questions that no amount of paperwork or policy tweaks can fully put to rest. Let's start with the central question that's haunted this whole mess from the beginning. How and why could bodies that families paid good money to have cremated, buried, or donated end up concealed, commingled, sold off, or shipped abroad, often with what looks like official paperwork backing it all up? It's the kind of puzzle that makes you wonder if the system's built to fail. Take the David Fuller inquiry, for instance. Its Phase 2 interim report laid bare this ugly mismatch between what the public expects and the cold reality of the laws on the books. Families think they're handing over their loved ones for a dignified end, but the regulations? They're full of gaps you could drive a hearse through. The report didn't mince words. There's a fundamental disconnect, it said, between societal norms and the regulatory framework that governs these practices. And that disconnect? It leaves room for the kind of shadows where bad things thrive. Then there are the ongoing regulatory reform debates. Everyone's talking about tightening inspections, beefing up enforcement, maybe even overhauling consent rules for body donations. But are these changes really going to catch up? Or are we just slapping bandages on a wound that's still bleeding? I spoke with a widow from Kent, still raw from the Fuller fallout. She told me, "I buried what I thought was my husband, but now I wonder if he's scattered across some lab overseas. How do you grieve that?" Her voice cracked when she said it, like the uncertainty was a fresh cut every day. It's stories like hers that highlight how these reforms might talk a big game about transparency, but bridging the gaps in consent and disclosure across this tangled web of body trade networks. That's a taller order. Especially when you're dealing with cross-border exports, where one country's rules fade into another's gray areas. And Let's not forget the scale and persistence of these illicit supply chains. Despite the prosecutions we've seen, how many more bodies are out there, unaccounted for, hidden behind forged documents or lax oversight? Experts debate it, but the truth is, we might never know the full extent. It's like chasing ghosts in a fog. You know how these things go. Promises of change on the surface, but the underground just adapts and keeps flowing. Globally, the challenges echo the same tune. Mismatched regulations, elusive transparency, and that human need for closure that's so often denied. Can legal reforms really fix this? Or are dignity and trust just words we throw around while the mysteries pile up? These unresolved questions linger, a reminder that advancements don't always chase away the dark. In our concluding segment, we pull these threads together and take one last look at reconciling dignity, trust, and the systemic failures in handling human remains. We've been digging through those stubborn questions that linger in the shadows of the funeral business. Legal tangles, regulatory gaps, moral gray areas that keep tripping up families and pushing reformers to their limits. Now, as we wrap this up, let's reckon with what it all means. The core of this mystery isn't just a few bad apples slipping through the cracks. It's how the whole system, built to honor the dead, ends up hiding lies and deceit on a massive scale. Think about it. The places we trust with our loved ones' final resting spots, turning into dens of betrayal. And the human cost. It's brutal. Grief doesn't just hit you once. When deceit piles on, it twists the knife deeper. I remember talking to Martha, a widow from Ohio, who prepaid for her husband's funeral trust, thinking it would ease the burden when the time came. She told me, her voice cracking over the phone, "I saved for years, Bill, scraping by on a fixed income, all to make sure he got a proper send-off. But when she needed it, the money was gone, siphoned off by some slick operator in the chain. She ended up borrowing from her kids just to bury him, and that betrayal? It poisoned her memories. Every time I visit his grave," she said, "I don't just mourn him. I rage at the system that stole our peace." Stories like hers aren't rare outliers. They're symptoms of a deeper rot. This isn't about isolated crimes. It's an environmental failure, where weak oversight lets deceit flourish like weeds in an untended plot. We need to see it that way, because fixing it demands more than slapping wrists. It calls for collective action, tighter laws that actually bite, consumers staying sharp and asking hard questions, industry players owning up to their messes, and real transparency. No more smoke and mirrors. Multidisciplinary solutions, blending policy wonks with everyday watchdogs to rebuild trust from the ground up. You know how these things go. Promises of reform shine bright in the spotlight, but fade quick when the heat's off. But here's the thing. We owe it to folks like Martha, and to everyone who's lost someone, to demand better. Hold this industry to a standard that truly respects dignity, builds unbreakable trust, and honors the finality of human remains. Because in the end, death is final, but the deceit, that lingers, poisoning what's left behind.
And if we don't fix it, well, the shadows just get longer.